hit the record button. And again, want to welcome everybody to today's call. And Karl, take it away. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Austin. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. It's good to be with you today. And I'm gonna do 20 to maybe 30 minutes of kind of setting up the premise of the book because it is different than usual, so that we can have as much conversation as possible about it. Oh, and Austin, I will need to be able to share the screen. Coming up with some of those notes. So I wrote this book called "Desizing the Church," and the subtitle is I've already had people who've told me I probably need to read that book because just that title has made me mad enough that I probably need to read it. But the subtitle might even make people madder, which is "How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next." So for anybody who's read any of my previous work or listened to the podcast or so on, this is not a departure, but a broadening of the ministry that the Lord has given us. And just to bring you up to speed, I've been at my current church for 31 years, the first 25 as the lead pastor, the most recent 6 as the teaching pastor. My youth pastor became the pastor. But this ministry that we call Helping Small Churches Thrive has grown so much over the last few years that as of January of this year, I am now full-time doing this. So I'm actually a missionary to the small church, networked approved ministry here in the SoCal Assemblies of God. To do that. So that is our full-time job right now, is ministering to and with small church pastors. But this book kind of expands that a little bit. This book isn't just for small church pastors. It's for anybody in church leadership. Because a couple of years ago, as I was writing all these resources and trying to find the best resources that I could to help small church ministry, I started asking myself, where did this obsession with bigness come from? Because that's a big part of the reason why I'm so busy, is because there aren't that many people doing what I do, that is helping with small church specific resources, which is strange because it applies to 90% of churches and half the Christians in the world. And how did we get so obsessed with just the bigness part of it? And so I thought there has to be a reason for that. These things don't come from nowhere. And so I did some research, and the book is the result of the research. So here's what we're going to do. Well, let me see if I've got the figure out my slide share thing here. We'll share it and see if it comes up properly. So are you seeing the Desizing the Church lead slide there? There we go. So here's the book, Desizing the Church. And I think, is that properly large on your screen for you? Should be. Alrighty.
Yeah, it looks good, Karl.
And there we go. Okay, so here are the 5 questions I want to take a look at today, and then we'll go into discussion after that. What is desizing? Secondly, why do we need to desize? Thirdly, where did our obsession with bigness come from? Which is the question that really launched the entire research into the book to begin with. Number 4, what are the dangers of pursuing bigness? And then 5th, how do we fix this? So let's take a look at these one at a time. First one we're going to take a look at is, what is desizing? I'm going to tell you right up front, it's a word I made up because the idea, I think, is fairly new, and I wanted a very concise way of phrasing it, and there wasn't anything in existence. So desizing is not downsizing. I'm not more in favor of small churches than big churches, and anybody who's heard or read anything that I've done in the last few years knows that I'm in favor of churches of all size. So it's not downsizing. It's not preferring small. But here's where it comes from. Numbers define us. They shouldn't, but they do. A pastor of a church of 3,000 is given more credibility typically than a pastor of a church of 300, and way more credibility than a pastor of a church of 30. We start with the assumption, if a church is 30, that something must be wrong. We just start with that assumption, and that's not a correct assumption to make. I believe that we have an unhealthy relationship with bigness in the church, and it's killing us. I think it is one of the main reasons for all the departures, for a lot of the church dysfunction, is this chase after bigness that we were never intended to be on. So what is desizing? Since I made the turn up, let me go ahead and define it for you. I define it in 2 different ways. First of all, it's the process of assessing the value of something without obsessing over numbers. And then secondly, in the church, choosing to evaluate the health and vitality of a congregation, a denomination, or a movement without using attendance figures, percentages, or numerical comparisons as the primary consideration. I'm not saying we can't use attendance figures, percentages, or numerical comparisons. I'm saying it can't continue to be not just our primary, but in some places our exclusive consideration in determining the health of a church. So the two key words in those two definitions are obsessing and primary. We have to stop obsessing over numbers, and we have to stop making them the primary consideration in everything that we look at. It's okay to count what counts, but using that as the only way that we assess a church's viability is a real problem. I'm convinced, and here's a quote from the book directly: our obsession with not just with numbers, but with big numbers may be the major but least acknowledged contributing factor in pastoral burnout, church scandals, divisiveness, misallocation of resources, and many other church dysfunctions. I'm absolutely convinced, and I believe I make the case well in the book, that this is a problem that is causing so many other problems. I don't believe it is the primary problem in the evangelical church, but I believe it's the biggest unacknowledged problem that we have, this chasing after numbers. So that's what desizing means. Second question, let's take a look at this. Why do we need to desize? In the book, I actually have a survey that is called the "Do I Need to Desize" survey that you can look at. It's in the chapter entitled "Desizing Pastors." And in it, there are 10 simple questions that you can fill out and answer with 0 for never, all the way up to 5 for always. And they're questions like, when you describe how well or poorly your church is doing, do you tend to use numbers? Always or never give yourself a score. Have you ever exaggerated your church's attendance figures? Always or never. Do you ever interpret a drive for bigger numbers as an expression of greater faith? Always, never, or something in between. And at the end of it, you can get a score of 50, which means you are really in trouble and you got to desize now, or 0, which means you probably lied on a few of the questions. Because I don't think anybody is without this obsession with size, including me. I'm convinced we have become obsessed with bigness at almost all costs. And I believe our obsession with chasing bigness has cost us a lot. And again, the problem isn't big churches. The problem is bigness. The problem is this obsessive drive with having to get bigger year after year. And here's an illustration of how we got here. We'll show this to you on the screen. Years ago, I went to, when I was a young man, before I went to Bible college, I went to a junior college in our hometown to get my general ed out of the way for free. And I sat in on an economics 101 class. That was one of the first classes I had as a young man in Bible college. And the economics teacher got up and he put this slide on the wall. And it was a slide with a whole bunch of these words: art, family, fairness, kindness, faith, joy, basically these kinds of things. And he said, take a look at these words. These are the things that are most important in life. And I literally checked my syllabus. Did I walk into the ethics class by mistake? No, this is economics 101. And then he said, that's what's important in life. I want you to remember that, because for the next 13 weeks, we are not going to talk about those things. For the next 13 weeks, we're going to talk about this. And then he put one slide on the screen with the word money in huge letters in the middle of it. He said, we are going to talk about money like it's the most important thing in the world. We're going to talk about how to make it. We're going to talk about how to invest it. We're going to talk about how it affects geoglobal politics. We are going to talk about money like it's the only thing that matters. But then he said, I want you to remember, this is what really matters. And he put the slide back up again of various values. And I thought, okay, that's actually a pretty positive way to start, I thought. And then he was true to his promise. For 13 years, he taught about money like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. And then in the last class, after he took up our finals, he put this, he put the slide back up again, where he said, okay, for 13 weeks now, we've been talking about money like it's the only thing that matters in life. But then I noticed something very different. This time when he put the value slide back up again, the room had changed. 13 years before, when he put up those values, everybody in the room was like, yeah, that's what matters. We get it. That's important in life. But next time when he put it up, the room had shifted. The room wasn't like, oh yeah, that's what's important. After 13 years of talking about money like it's the only thing that matters, this is what it felt like. He was talking about all these other things at the very end, but in 13 weeks, he had begun to reprogram our brains unintentionally to actually think that money was the most important thing in the world. So what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, for 40 years now, I've gone to church conferences church growth conferences specifically, which is most of them. And we walk in the room and we assume, and maybe even there's a little bit talked about, hey, these are the things that really matter. Church health is what matters. Worship and ministry and unity and maturity. These are the things that really matter. But for this conference, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about church growth. And for 40 years, I have gone to conferences where those other values have been assumed, but church growth has been sometimes the only topic of conversation. And so we come back to the slide and we think, well, this is what matters. But I got to think, after 40 years, it's kind of like this. If you take a look at the most popular conferences, the conference is talking about integrity. The conference is talking about discipleship. Those aren't the big attended conferences. How to get your numbers up, how to 10x your numbers in the next 2 years. Those are the conferences, those are the webinars that seem to get the biggest attendance. If 13 weeks can begin to rewire a bunch of students' brains from real thinking that family is the most important thing to thinking that money is the most important thing, what has 40 years of this done to our brains? And I'm convinced of this because it did that to my brain. It did that to me, and I've had to reestablish what the most important things are in the world. So that's why this matters. So with all of that in mind, let's get to the next one, which is, where did our obsession with bigness come from? Because this kind of thing doesn't come from nowhere. Why is this so much the important part of our conversation? So I did some research, and here's what I discovered, fascinatingly to me, was I wanted to do a study of the church growth movement, and I discovered that there were actually two church growth movements. So let me walk you through most of them. Most church leaders are not aware of this. I was not aware of it until I did the deep dive into the research. There were two church growth movements. The first church growth movement, I call it the McGavran stream. Donald McGavran was a missionary in India from the late 1920s until the late 1930s until the late 60s. And when he was a missionary in India, he started hearing about entire villages that were coming to Christ all at once. And he thought, this is crazy. This can't be the case. But he did the research. He went to these villages and discovered this was actually happening. So he started wondering, what's happening? Why is this happening? And what can we learn from this so that we can learn about how do people movements come to Christ? And so he started doing the research on it. When he retired in the late 60s, he traveled to Africa for a little while where there were similar things happening. Then he came home and he wrote his first book called The Bridges of God. The Bridges of God is one of the most important works in Christian leadership in the last 100 years. Both McGavran and his book are almost unknown for anybody who's under 40, and not extremely well known even for those of us who are over 40. But he is one of the most important figures, and his book is one of the most important books of the last 100 years, because almost everything we know, almost everything we talk about, and even the terminology that we use regarding church growth came from Donald McGavran. He literally was the first person who put the term church growth into print in the Bridges of God. He talked about things like the homogeneous unit principle and the kinds of questions that we should be asking about why churches are growing or aren't growing. So Donald McGavran did all of that. But what's fascinating was this. He started the Church Growth Institute at Fuller in 1965. He was 68 years of age. And in 1965, he started the Church Growth Institute. For the first 7 years, he would not allow American pastors to attend. Now, he couldn't just say, no American pastors allowed, you get in trouble when you do that. So what he did was he came up with 3 requirements that would exclude 99.9% of us. That is, you had to be fluent in a second language. You had to have done a lot of field work in a place outside of the U.S. And third, you had to show by writing a paper that you had a very high knowledge of another indigenous people group outside of your own. And with those requirements, again, 99.9% of American pastors didn't qualify for it, which was his intention. He wanted to exclude American pastors. And the reason was he was convinced that if American pastors got a hold of his church growth ideas, that we'd turn it into something that he never intended. Quite frankly, that we'd turn it into a big church contest. His point was not that individual churches get bigger. When he coined the term church growth, when he created a lot of the language and a lot of the questions that we just take for granted today, His idea was, how do people movements come to Christ? How do we increase the percentage of Christians within a particular neighborhood? Not how do churches become bigger? Now, what happened was American pastors were beginning to read his book and wanting in the class. And for 7 years, he resisted it until finally he couldn't resist it anymore. And then in 1972, at the age of 75, he finally gave in to the overwhelming requests. And along with C. Peter Wagner, one of his original students, he taught the first ever Church Growth Institute class for American pastors. And that class in 1972, that was only attended by about 20 students or so, is absolutely universally considered the spark point for the entire church growth movement. 1972, when McGavran was 75. And so what was it about McGavran? Why was he worried about introducing this to the American pastors? And here's why. Because the second church growth stream was what I call the American stream. And the American stream pre-existed the McGavran stream by several hundred years. So let's talk about the American stream. Why is bigness such a particularly American obsession? Not an exclusively American obsession, but we kind of perfected it. We're big about it. And if any of y'all are from Texas, you guys have it down. Okay, but the rest of us are pretty good at it too. We are obsessed with bigness. This obsession with bigness actually goes back to some of America's best ideas. And by best ideas, I mean the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights to the Constitution of the United States is about as good an idea as people have had since the Bible was written. I mean, it's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, that the people will govern themselves. These are unbelievably positively revolutionary ideas. But the First Amendment has some unintended consequences that we aren't really aware of today. For example, the people who wrote those original amazing documents came mostly from Northern Europe. And in most of the Northern Europe countries, they had state churches. Now, that's what they were escaping from. They didn't want the government to tell them how to worship, so no state church. Okay, great. But when you've got a state church, then when the state collects taxes, the state also collects tithes and then distributes them to the pastors of the state churches. So if you pastored a state church in Germany or in Britain or in the Netherlands or in Denmark 200 some years ago, you didn't have to get a big crowd in the building. You got a government check every month that paid your salary and that paid for the expenses of the entire building. Do you realize there are still a couple countries in Europe that do that today? I was just in Germany. They still do this in Germany. You still pay, you can still pay your tithes through your taxes if you're paying it to the Catholic or the Lutheran Church in Germany, still today. Now, that's probably going to go away pretty quickly, but it's still today. So in America now, we have freedom of religion. We can worship whoever we want, whenever we want, or not worship at all. But if you do start a church, the government ain't paying for it. So for the first time in history, if you want to draw a crowd, if you want to get bigger, if you want to impact this community, you've got to get your numbers up in order to get your finances up, in order to pay your salary, in order to pay for the building. And the entrepreneurial pastor is born. So it's an unintended consequence of some of America's best ideas, which is why it's so strong here in America. And then it kind of stayed that way for a while. And then it supercharged because in the 1950s and 60s, the Highway Act, Dwight Eisenhower signed that the interstates were going to be built. And because of the building of the interstates, now the ability for a father, typically, to travel from his business in the city to now the new thing called the suburbs changes the dynamic of the way the family operates. So because of the interstates, families no longer ran their single family business in the city or ran the family farm so much, but you had a whole migration of people going to the suburbs where mom and the kids lived during the day in the suburbs with all kinds of space and big shopping malls and big parks and big schools. And the churches followed, and the churches looked around and said, wow, they're all going to the shopping mall. This really works. And if you take a look, picture in your mind the typical megachurch in America. What do you picture in your mind? Likely what you are picturing is a very large facility on acres and acres and acres of land in a wealthy suburb outside of a large city. The reason you're picturing that is because that's where 80% of American megachurches are. They are in large, wealthy suburbs outside of large cities. Massive churches tend not to happen where Christians are increasing as a percentage of the population. Massive churches tend to happen where Christians have money. Now, that's not a criticism. That's just simply a demographic reality. And I live in one of those places. I live in Orange County, California. We've got all these mega churches that have popped up over the last 40 years. But I can tell you, my county has not become more godly over the last 40 years with the advent of all the mega churches around us. So that's typically not what happens. If you do take a look around the world at the places where Christians are increasing as a percent of the population, it's almost exclusively because healthy small churches are multiplying, not because churches are getting larger. In most of the places where churches are getting bigger, it's not because Christians are increasing as a percentage of the population. It's because Christians are gathering into larger groups. It's not growth, it's consolidation. And a lot of what we're doing research on now outside of me is beginning to discover that and beginning to ask ourselves some very serious questions about that.
Okay.
So basically, what's been happening is this. We're swimming in what I call the American how I did it stream, while using the language of the McGavran how to do it stream. And this is one of the biggest differences between the American ideas and the McGavran ideas. McGavran looked around and saw an entire people movements coming to Christ and going, how is God doing this? And what can we learn from the underlying principles? But when you go to an American church growth conference, typically what you get is the pastor of the largest church in the room speaks and says, here's how we did it in our church, and now you go do it in yours. And most of us walk away and we get discouraged because we try to do it in our church and it doesn't work that way because they're not universal principles. They're usually specific to that location. And so there's this disparity there. So that gives you some idea of some of the breakdown that we do in the book of the history and where it comes from. But now let's get to question number 4. So what are some of the dangers of bigness? What are the dangers of pursuing bigness? And let me give you 2 things. First of all, an overconfidence in our abilities. And secondly, an oversimplification of our goals. And I'll walk through each of those one at a time. First of all, let's take a look at what I call an overconfidence in our abilities. There's a fascinating phenomenon that I discovered recently called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect, you can see the scale on your screen there. On the left, going up and down, the higher you go towards the top, the more confident you are in your abilities and in your understanding. But on the bottom, from left to right, the farther you go to the right, the more actual knowledge and the more actual experience you possess. Okay. And this is how people typically learn. All right. So let's take a look at it. This is how the scale looks, and it goes something like this. So let me walk you through the way it happens. So you bottom left there, when you don't know anything about something, you have no confidence in your ability because you don't know anything about something, right? And then you watch a YouTube video. And you come out immediate and you come to what I call the peak of overconfidence. I didn't know anything about this, but I watched this guy on YouTube. Oh, that's the answer. And you're completely confident in it, but you're really overconfident in it. This is where a lot of first year seminary graduates are, right? They've gone through Bible college. They've learned enough to go, wow, I really got this thing locked. And they come out in the first year and they're like, whoa, I've got this thing figured out. Or this is where the staff pastor who's built a great youth group or a great worship team decides, I'm going to plant a church and I'm going to do the same thing in that other church that happened here, and we're going to grow like crazy. And that first year, they're filled with all kinds of overconfidence. But if they continue to learn and if they continue to practice the thing, what they discover is that confidence doesn't last very long because reality hits them square in the face, and they drop from what I call the peak of overconfidence to the valley of underconfidence. This is where I believe a lot of 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th year Bible college graduates walk away from ministry entirely. They come out and they go, ooh, I've got it all figured out. I'm at a peak of overconfidence. They don't realize that's where they are. And then they get working on it and they're going, oh, this is much harder than I thought. Oh, this is really complicated. Oh, those things don't work at all. And then they begin to question their calling. Maybe I'm not called. Maybe I don't have a clue here. And they walk away. But here's the good news. If they continue to actually learn, if they continue to gain actual experience, they get a chance to go through the next step, which is to walk up what's called the slope of experience. And notice the slope of experience. It's fascinating. On the slope of experience, your experience and your confidence in your abilities increases at the same rate, and that becomes sustainable. And then you get to what I actually call the plateau of stability, of sustainability. You can sustain this for a long period of time. Now, here's what I want to point out to you that's really fascinating here. When you get to that plateau of sustainability, you will never, ever be as overconfident as you were at the peak of overconfidence because of what I call the gap of humility. I actually know way, way, way more about pastoring now than I did 40 years ago, over 40 years ago when I started doing this. But I'm not as confident in my abilities today as I was back then because I was overconfident then. And here's the other part of it as a pastor. If you are at the plateau of sustainability, or even if you're going up the slope of experience and you're learning as you go, there's always going to be somebody on the peak of overconfidence who's convinced you're an idiot. Right? There's always going to be somebody who knows less than you, who has less experience than you. I mean, we experienced this during the pandemic like crazy. All these people all of a sudden became experts and had a pastor at church who'd never done it a day in their lives because they were sitting on the peak of overconfidence because they watched a YouTube video. So now why am I giving this to you? What does this have to do with the whole desizing the church and the church growth movement? Here's what it is. I'm convinced that for the last 40 years, since early 1980s, when the church growth stuff really hit hard, I'm convinced that we've had about 30 to 40 years on the peak of overconfidence. We've learned some really cool new stuff over the last 40 years. There's an entire chapter in my book entitled What the Church Growth Movement Got Right, because I think the church growth movement did a whole bunch of things really, really well, and I'm grateful for them. But we got a little overconfident. We got a little arrogant. We got a little cocky, right? If it's all healthy things grow, you do this, it's automatic, it's guaranteed, it's going to happen. No, reality shows us that's not the case. And now nobody's looking around in the American evangelical church and going, yeah, we got this thing figured out. We are locked and loaded, ready to go. We are going to take over the culture. No, we are now currently in the American evangelical church in the second place. We are in the valley of underconfidence. If you talk to the average pastor now, you're not going to hear all kinds of arrogance. You're going to hear, man, we're in trouble now and I don't know what we're going to do. We got so many churches closing. We don't have enough pastors coming into ministry, right? Here's an example. Here's a real vivid example of this. In the 1990s and the 2000s, here are the books that everybody read. And if you're at my age in ministry, you probably read every one of those books. Your church can grow. Your church has real possibilities. How to break growth barriers, right? Purpose-driven church, natural church development, simple church. I read every single one of those books from people who were like, we've got it figured out. You're going to do this. And it was positive and it was encouraging. And quite frankly, we got arrogant. Nobody's reading those books today. You want to know what they're reading today? Take a look at what we're reading today. That's what we're reading today. The Great Evangelical Recession, Unchristian, the rise of the nuns. Why bother with church? The autopsy of a dead church, the great de-churching. And now I'll throw my book into the mix because my book is a part of that particular phase of books right now, desizing the church. Take that list on the left. Nobody's reading those books anymore. That was from the peak of overconfidence. Now we're in the valley of underconfidence, but I've got to tell you, there's real hope. Those are not, if you read those books and you take carefully what they're saying, they're actually not depressing. They are challenging. They are realistic. They offer positive forward motion, as does mine. But we've made that shift. So this whole arrogance period that we've had, it needs to go. Because going back for a second, we need to go through the valley of underconfidence in order to get to the plateau of stability through the slope of experience. It's necessary. Where we are right now is not something Jesus is worried about. Okay? We're going to make it through this, and we have to get through this in order to get to a more mature phase of Christian movement and of church leadership. I'm convinced this is a necessary correction from the peak of overconfidence that we had for far too many years. Okay, so we've got to realize that we've got to deal with that. That's one of the problems of pursuing bigness is this overconfidence in our abilities, which we're beginning to come down from. But again, let's not go down too far because there is hopefulness. The second issue is an oversimplification of our goals. Here's what most church growth ideas have looked like, and most church growth research has shown us. We've had a linear view of size and health. A church is either on the left, small and presumed unhealthy, or going towards the right, bigger and bigger and presumed more and more healthy. We just assume this. Here's an example. A year or two ago, there was a survey, and the headline that came out from Gallup was, I believe it was Gallup or Barnett, doesn't matter, was 2/3 of churches are stalled or declining. And I thought, well, that's worse news than even I thought. So I read it through, but then I looked at the research behind it, and here's what I discovered. 1/3 of churches in the survey were numerically increasing, 1/3 of churches were numerically stable, and 1/3 of churches were numerically declining. So the headline was 2/3 of churches are stalled or declining. But the headline just as accurately could have been 2/3 of churches are maintaining or increasing. That's just as true. But we've got this presumption that if we're not numerically increasing year to year, we must be broken, we must be stuck, there must be something wrong. And that isn't necessarily so. Is that so? In some cases, yes. But it's also true that there's some churches that are increasing numerically who aren't doing it in a healthy way. And there's some churches that are actually decreasing numerically because they've made some difficult decisions to go some hard roads with Jesus, and they've lost some people because of it. So we've got to stop making this presumption. This is what's called a one-dimensional. It's a, like, mathematically, that a line is one-dimensional. Let's at least break it out to 2 dimensions, shall we? Here's what I recommend we do: an expanded view of size and health. You still have the small and unhealthy church in the bottom left, and you still have big and healthy churches in the top right. But we also have big and unhealthy churches in the top left, and we have small and healthy churches in the bottom right. Let's separate size from health. And when we do, we can look at it and go, okay, instead of presuming that big teaches small every single time, let's presume that healthy should teach unhealthy, whether they're big or small on either side. Now, it's more likely that the big and unhealthy church is going to learn more from the big and healthy church because of processes and systems that they share. And it's more likely that the small and unhealthy church is going to learn more from the small and healthy church than from the big and healthy church. But right now, we're not even presuming that anybody can learn anything from small and healthy, let alone that small and healthy can teach something to big and unhealthy. Now, that's beginning to change. I've done some consultation with multi-site churches that are growing and they're really large, but that on each site, their local site pastor, who's now trying to pastor a smaller group of people because they're doing this intentionally, they have no idea how to pastor small because they've been raised in big. And I've actually done some consultation there. So there are big churches reaching out to the small and healthy and going, help us. We need to figure out how to do small better. So that's a good sign. But let's go to number 5, and then we'll go into some conversation about this. How do we fix this? Well, in the book, I have some methods and ideas in the last 3 chapters that are entitled Desizing the Pastor, Desizing the Congregation, and Desizing Evangelicalism. But the turning point of the book towards the positive is 2 chapters. And here's what they're titled. I'll give you them to you one at a time. The title of the first chapter that makes the turn is this: Discipleship Fixes Everything. Now, that's a pretty bold 3 words, but I'm convinced it's true. I want you to stop and I want you to think for a moment. Can you think of a problem a church might have that discipleship won't fix? Lack of volunteers, discipleship will fix that. Lack of finances, discipleship will fix that. Disunity, immorality, bad theology, discipleship fixes it, discipleship fixes it, discipleship fixes it. Right? This is why Jesus gave us one assignment. Go build my church. No, that wasn't the assignment he gave us. Jesus said, okay, I'll build my church. You go make disciples. Why? Because discipleship fixes everything. But I've got this comedic conversation that goes on in my head when it comes to this. And I can imagine Jesus going, okay, everybody, I'm going to build my church. You go make disciples. And we go, got it. We're going to go build a church. No, 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 no. I'm going to build a church, Jesus says. You go make disciples. Oh, I get it now. We'll go build a church. No. But for 40 years, we've been behaving that way. We've been behaving like, okay, we'll go build the church, Jesus. And I'm convinced Jesus is like, stop this. I did not tell you to build a church. I'm building the church. I'm better at it than you. Make disciples. Why? Because discipleship fixes everything. Actually, there's only one thing discipleship won't fix, and that's this. Discipleship won't fix the size of your church. First of all, because the size of your church is not a problem to fix. And secondly, because if you choose to do discipleship as your primary thing, there will be times when you will have to choose between, do we choose the discipleship option or the get the big church bigger option? Most of the time, discipleship and church numerical growth will go side by side and will have no conflict. But there will come occasional times when getting the church bigger will ask you to go this way and discipleship will ask you to go a different way. And we need to pre-decide. We will always choose discipleship over numerical increase. Discipleship fixes everything. And then the second one, and we'll conclude with this before we go into some conversation. The second chapter where I make the turn in the book is entitled "Integrity is the New Competence." This goes back to that opening illustration in that economics class, right? All those words were about character, were about virtues, were about integrity. And what we've done is for two generations now in the church, we have taught pastoral competence. We have taught technique. We've taken integrity for granted. We show up in the room and we assume, well, we're all Christians here. We all know the stuff we're all supposed to be doing, right? Can anybody believe we can take integrity for granted anymore? Anybody? I don't take integrity for granted anymore. We can't take integrity for granted anymore. So what do we need to do? We need to teach integrity. We've spent 40 years teaching technique. We need to spend the next 40 years teaching integrity with the same passion that we taught technique for the previous 40. Because here's the deal. You will not find a single person who says they are deconstructing their faith, who says that the reason behind it is because the church didn't have their techniques right. Well, I was going to serve Jesus, but the band stunk. So what am I to do? No. But you'll find a lot of people who say they're deconstructing or they're ex-evangelical or they're de-churching, whatever term they use. You'll find a lot of them who say they're leaving because they can't trust us anymore. Now, sometimes it's because of their lack of integrity, but nobody's leaving the faith because we didn't get our technique right. We cannot get ourselves out of this situation by getting better techniques. That's not where we're going to get there. We have to be people of integrity again. This is what the culture is calling us back to, I'm convinced. They're calling us back to be people that they can trust, to be people of integrity again. No one who has deconstructed their faith does so because they saw a deficiency in the technical excellence of their church services. That's what we have to change. So for years, I was told, you got to set bigger plans. You got to set big plans. If you're going to have faith, you got to set big plans. And here's what I would propose as the closing statement. Instead of setting bigger plans, we need to set a moral compass. We need to restore integrity again. Anyway, all of that, we'll go back to conversation now. Just if you want anything further on that, go to my website, karlvaters.com. The ministry is called Helping Small Churches Thrive. You can pick up the book, Desizing the Church, anywhere. And right now on my podcast, The Church Lobby, I'm doing a 6, 7, maybe even 8-part series on desizing the church, where I'm actually interviewing several of the authors that I cite at length in the book about the conversations that are about the subjects that are in the book. So you can follow the podcast there as well. But let's go back, Austin, to you and see if we've got any Q&A to go.
Thanks, Karl. Yeah, feel free to drop your questions into the chat as they come to you. One question I'm seeing here, are you seeing discipleship fixes everything? You've said that. Are you seeing in your travels, Karl, any common discipleship methods or strategies being implemented by healthy churches? What is a healthy strategy for discipleship look like that you've seen?
Yeah, a lot of what we call discipleship in the church has really not been discipleship. It's been classwork. Let's have a discipleship class and we sit down and we teach them again. And the difference between discipleship and teaching is relationship. So if you take a look at the life of Jesus or even the Apostle Paul, Jesus taught crowds. He couldn't disciple crowds. He discipled a smaller number of people with whom he was in constant relationship. The Apostle Paul, constantly had every place he went, he had a different group of leaders with him because he was leaving them behind after they'd been disciples to pastor the churches that they were planting. But it all happened in relationship. And so I think this is one of the strengths of the small church. It's also one of the strengths of the healthy big church is that they understand they need to grow smaller and bigger at the same time. And they're putting people into intentional mentoring relationships. So the difference is the relational aspect of it. We cannot disciple large throngs of people. You can only disciple when you're in relationship with people and over the long term. So that's why I'm saying we have to commit ourselves for the long term for this, because discipleship doesn't happen quickly. You can draw a crowd fast. You cannot disciple fast. So it has to be slow, it has to be intentional, and it has to be relational.
I think there's a question that was just dropped in the chat. I think there's some effort to kind of talk about health, but we haven't entirely detached it from growth. So there's a breaking the 200 barrier mentality that is still kind of present here in this church health conversation. And so the question here being asked is, how do we begin to change that? Because it's become such a part of our ethos that even conversations about developing healthy systems have this number attached to them. How would you respond to a comment like that?
Yeah, we have to ask better questions. Actually, in the appendix of the book, I have a church health assessment tool, and it asks some questions about some church health issues and asks, how's your church doing in these areas? And you can get a score at the end that will give you an idea of whether or not your church is as healthy as you think it might be or not. And then you at least have an idea of what you're looking at. But we just simply have to ask better questions. When the title of the conference is Breaking the 200 Barrier, then that's like putting money on the screen and going, okay, we're going to talk about money like it's all that matters. But in fact, these things are. But it rewires our brain. That's why this question, every time I do this talk, that question is always asked, and understandably so. Like, then if it's not about numbers, what's it about? And isn't it weird that a whole bunch of pastors can get together and we sincerely don't have a quick answer to the question of, well, if not numbers, how do we know a church is healthy? So again, I'll refer you to the appendix. Let me grab it here because I gotta remember what I wrote half the time, and it's not all that easy because, well, I'm a simple guy who doesn't remember even simple things sometimes, even the stuff that I wrote. So let me read a couple of them for you as an example. Under the idea of creativity, it goes under 4 categories. So the 4 categories are theology, leadership, mission, and attitude. And under each one of them, there are 4 statements that you can answer: not at all, 0, or always 5, just like the previous one. One of them, for instance, theology, the Bible. The eternal truths of the Bible are taught well and applied to our lives in practical ways. Is that happening? If so, that's a sign of health. Worship through song, prayer, and action is an essential focus of our congregation. Is that true or not? Salvation, people are coming to faith in Jesus through the ministry of our church. Yes or no, we haven't baptized anybody in a decade, right? These are not tied directly to numbers, but when you get a sense of some of the questions, that helps. Secondly, I would recommend this, and I'm recommending this a lot lately to my fellow small church pastor friends. When we go to conferences and network or district councils or whatever you're calling them now in your district or network or whatever the name is. So here in Southern Cal, this week is our network conference, what used to be called district council. And I know when I go, well, maybe not me so much anymore because I'm a small church guy and everybody knows that. But I know that when everybody else goes, they're going to have this, so what you're running question. It's going to be automatic. So here's what I encourage, especially small church pastors to do, but I think everybody to do. Have a couple life transformation stories ready to tell. Because if somebody just out of nowhere asks you, say, what you're running, and it isn't good and you don't want to get on the numbers thing, you kind of, and then it sounds like you're not wanting to talk about the numbers because they're so bad or whatever. Instead, have a couple life transformation stories in the chamber ready to go and say, let me tell you what's happening at our church. We just did this ministry and we reached out to our neighborhood and here's what happened. Let me tell you about this couple that just came to faith in Christ. They were doing this and they were doing that and they came in and it took them 6 months till they finally said yes. And yes, now they're being saved. I just had this amazing example. I was talking with a pastor of a church. They have 60 people in a typical Sunday morning attendance. They have 65 people watching online. And I don't mean like occasionally coming in, but live every service. They have 65 people watching online. They live in a very post-Christian culture. He says 60 in person, 65 faithfully watching online every single week. And he said, we've done the stats. Typically, it's 18 months of watching online before they show up in person. And most of the time, when they're showing up in person for the first time after watching us online for 18 months, it's because they gave their lives to Christ online and they have to come in person to be baptized. And for many of them, the first time we see them is on the Sunday they come to be baptized. And from that point on, they physically attend in person. Now, that's a story I want to hear. Right now, is it a church of 60? Is it a church of 125? I don't care. I want to know stories like that.
So another question here, Karl. I think you've talked, heard you talk about metrics, and this is part of our obsession with metrics. But are there some other ways that we could look at health that gets kind of below the surface, especially in conversations with, for instance, in board meetings, when those who are sitting around the board table are accustomed to looking at attendance and giving as our metrics for success. What are some of the ways that maybe we could start to change that conversation in that kind of boardroom setting when we've been used to asking those questions to determine our trajectory?
Yeah, some of it, as I said earlier, we need to have new conversations. And I think in some ways we need to use better terminology. So 25 years ago, I started changing the word giving to generosity in our church. And I didn't talk about we need to get our giving up. I talked about we need to get our generosity up. And then I started looking around and started realizing in a small church, for instance, a lot of the generosity of a small church happens off book. So I started looking around and going, okay, last year we gave X amount to missions, like literally to the World Missions Department of the Assemblies of God. We gave X amount and it looks pitiful, right? But that's not all we gave last year, because last year we did this big event for the community where people showed up with equipment and supplies and just brought food from their home and they put it. And so what I did was for a couple of years, I actually started to count all of the goods and services that were legitimately given by church members that didn't flow through our books. And I'm not talking even about hours that they worked. That's completely off book, and I didn't even count that. I'm talking about they physically brought an item from home. They physically brought canned food in, right? They physically said, hey, don't worry about buying the supplies for that because I'll cover the supplies for that. That's completely off book. But I started keeping track of it. And I started realizing that we had a far more generous church than we thought we had. We went from, I think we were barely 10% given to missions through the Assemblies of God Missions Department program. But when we started looking at all the actual gifts that were actually given that had actual monetary value that were off book, we came to over 40%. So we realized, hey, we're a way more generous church than the books show. But it's not just us saying, yeah, we're generous. I actually did the counting of it, but I had to count something different than what we're used to counting. So we've got to look around for those opportunities. We have to think more creatively about what's actually happening in our church. And when you do that, you'll find some things, and it'll be different in every church.
One final question here. It seems like you've identified this issue of, when larger churches are, those pastors, those leaders are the ones who populate our conferences. Sometimes there's just a dearth of settings where we can hear from small healthy, that small healthy category that you've
Mhm.
identified. Have you seen anything that is, I don't know, an environment where those stories can be shared well in your travels?
Yeah.
I know this is what you're beating the drum on, but are there kind of cohorts that come together that you've identified that you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, they're still a very small percentage of the whole, but they're beginning. And part of the reason I'm going full time doing this now, and I still attend our home church. It's still our home church. It's still where we serve, but I'm just not being paid by them anymore because we're doing this full time as missionaries to the small church. Part of the reason we're having to go full time into this is because I'm receiving a lot more invitations than I ever did before to actually go and to do small church cohorts, like I'm doing right now, a small church webinar. Tomorrow, I'll be on the Influence, well, we will be recording the Influence podcast about this. Last year, I spoke at 40 in-person conferences, and I've already spoken at 20 this year. It's like I gotta watch I gotta watch my schedule and I gotta watch my output because it could overwhelm me very quickly. It is still a very small percentage of the whole, but yes, there are ways to do small church specific cohorts. And here's something I've discovered that's very encouraging. I've been doing this 11 years now. For the first 5 or 6 years, easily, if you put the word small in the title of the conference, nobody showed up. Like a pastor of a church of 20 would go, I'm not going to that. It's for small churches. And their friend would go, you're pastoring 20 people. But it feels like failure. It feels like I'm admitting defeat if I show up at a small church conference. That's still there, but it's a little less than it used to be. People are looking around, especially since COVID, and everybody's pretty ready to admit, yeah, we're in trouble now. We need the help. So creating environments like this where it can be more than just simply teaching, but like I was recently at a conference, had this amazing opportunity to go to Europe. And believe it or not, in Germany, there's a Willow Creek conference that they still do. And I spoke to 7,000 pastors in the room. Just never spoken to that big a crowd. 70 is typical for me, not 7,000. And there were some great things about it, but I got to tell you, I walked into that place and didn't know anybody, and I walked out of that place and I didn't know anybody. But if I walk into a conference of 70, I walk out, I'm going to know somebody there, especially if we do it overnight into the next day and we have lunches and conversations and intentional places where we can have some dialogue. I have become friends with pastors all over the country and all around the world because the conferences were intentionally for small churches and were kept intentionally at a size where we can have the dialogue and have the conversation that we need. And then I've seen these conversations continue because relationships developed at these places. So we need to start thinking differently about what the room is even going to look like when we get together.
Appreciate that, Karl. And thanks for your time here. Thanks everybody for joining in on today's call. I hope it was encouraging to you, something that you can kind of take back and ponder. Be sure to pick up a copy of Karl's book. It does a deeper dive into some of the history that he shared during the first part of today's call. And thank you. Have a blessed week, pastors.
Thanks, everybody.